Welcome to View Troubleshooting, Looking Under the Hood. My name is Matt Coppinger. I'm a consulting architect with VMware. Our agenda today, we'll be looking at some of the common issues you may face in a View environment. We'll also be looking at the different problem domains that exist within a View architecture, and we'll look at some of the things that can go wrong, how you can identify if something's going wrong, and in some cases how you can fix some of these issues. We'll also be looking at some of the resources you can use to help you troubleshoot VMware View. Some of the common issues we see in VMware View. Some of the examples we have are when users, for example, can't even connect to the View connection server, or maybe users get randomly disconnected from their sessions. Sometimes we can also see a bad quality of display, or maybe that a user cannot access a desktop when they think it should be available. Also, of course, IT administrators or people administrating VMware View may see errors in the View console itself, in vCenter server or on vSphere, or it may be just the fact that the users are complaining that their desktops are slow. We'll cover each of these areas and look at some of the issues that could cause these things and how to rectify them. So let's take a look at the problem domains within a View environment. So first, let's quickly discuss and go over the View architecture. At the front end of View, of course, are the View clients. These are the physical end devices that users will use and have a View client installed on them. The users will then connect to the VMware View Manager or connection server, and this potentially could be a security server sitting in a DMZ or a connection server on a local area network. The VMware View Manager and Connection Server will provision and provide power operations to View desktops running on a vSphere environment. The View desktops have the View agent running on the desktop, and of course the View desktops are running on vSphere. vSphere itself is managed by vCenter Server, and View Connection Server or View Manager will talk to vCenter Server to provision desktops or perform those power operations. Also within the environment we have View Composer. View Composer is used to provision link clones of View desktops. This allows us to provide a single image desktop and then simply provide delta disks or just difference disks for each user that may request a desktop, and therefore we're not having to store an entire desktop image for every single desktop. Finally, of course, vSphere will also have networking and storage platforms that it will use to provide connectivity in the environment and also to store the View desktops. So now that we understand the architecture of VMware View and the basic functions of the different View components, it's much easier for us to understand where a problem may exist and which problem domain we need to focus on. For example, if the user is having issues connecting to a VMware View Manager, we probably want to look at the configuration of the View client, the network that connects the View connection server, and of course the View connection server itself. Also, for example, if a user is having performance issues or their desktop was running slowly in their opinion, we probably want to look at the vSphere environment, the compute and storage platform, to see if there are any performance issues there. So the goal of today really is to take a look at some of the common issues in these different problem domains and show you how you can identify them and fix them where possible. So let's quickly go over some of the keys to troubleshooting View. Of course, the first place to check in a VMware View environment is the administrator console. This is accessible via a web page on the View connection server. Check your product documentation for more. But once you have access to the View Administrator console, you can click on the dashboard, and this will give you a number of system health indicators, and it will show you a green, yellow or red status of the various View components. In the picture on the slide you can see that everything is green bar the event database, which is yellow, and that's because it hasn't been configured yet. However, if there were any problem desktops or problem pools, then one of these components would be shown in red with a red down arrow. Now, of course, that's a manual check. If you wanted to automate checking the status of the VMware View environment, it would be very easy to connect a enterprise monitoring solution to the event database. and it can check or query the event database to see if there are any specific events that have occurred that would indicate that there's a problem in the environment. We'll be going over some of the key event logs in the event database over the next few slides. One of the other good ways of troubleshooting Vue is to deeply understand the client connection process. This is where many of the common issues occur, and we'll be going through this in detail further on. And the final piece here is to check the different logs for each of the components within Vue. So you can check the logs on the connection broker, the Vue agent logs that sit on the Vue desktop, or even possibly the PCROP logs that are also on the Vue desktop. And of course, at the end of the day, you can also check our knowledge base article site, kb.vmware.com. So let's take a look at the first problem domain, failure to communicate. This is really about client connectivity issues. Some of the common issues we see is that the Vue client can't connect to the Vue connection server. There may be a logon failure where the user or user's password is not accepted by Vue connection server itself. The user may experience a black screen when they do attempt to connect to their virtual desktop. A poor quality of display would indicate some kind of problem with the display protocol, or maybe what appears to be a randomly disconnected session. So where do we look to see if there is an issue with client connectivity? The first and best place to look is the connection broker logs. To get the location of the logs for your particular installation, I would check the product documentation. But once you have access to the connection broker logs, we can actually identify some of the key steps or processes as a client connects. The first thing to look for, and here you can see on the line client connects, is whenever a Vue client attempts to establish connection with Vue Manager, Vue Manager will collect together its configuration information, such as the domains that are available to it, and pass that back to the Vue client. And this is prior to any kind of authentication. So here on where you see client connects, you can see within the broker logs, this line will indicate that a client did successfully connect to the connection server and configuration information was returned. Once the Vue client has that configuration information, the user may enter their username and password to authenticate to the connection broker. And on the connection broker, you will see the line where it says client sends username password, attempting authentication against Active Directory. Here you can see that the connection server successfully received the user's username and password. The next step, of course, is for then the connection server or broker to attempt to authenticate the user to the domain. And here in this next line, you'll see attempting to authenticate the user administrator in domain and prior. So here you can see that the broker has successfully received the username and password and is now passing that on to Active Directory to check to see if the user is entitled to use Vue connection server. If the user has been authenticated, the broker will then establish this in the logs by logging the line the domain and username has successfully authenticated to VDM or Virtual Desktop Manager. This is the old obsolete name for VMware Vue. So here you can see with these 4 lines in the logs, you can see that a user has successfully connected to the connection server and authenticated against the connection server is now effectively logged in. From an event database perspective, you should expect to see the broker user logged in log within the actual event database itself. One thing to look for here, if you can see on the 4th connection broker log on the slide, you'll see in bold a unique GUID. This GUID represents the unique session ID for that user and that user's session. On that specific connection broker within those logs, that session ID can be used to correlate a number of events specific to that user's session. So keep that in mind as we go along throughout the next few slides. Going back to some of our client connectivity issues, clearly if a Vue client or any of your Vue clients can't connect to the connection server, these logs won't actually exist on the connection server logs. Of course, if there are, then clearly some of your Vue clients have actually been able to connect to the Vue connection server. If you're still having issues with individual Vue clients, it's probably good to check the configuration of the Vue client. Make sure that the URL the Vue client is using is correct and that the connection server can be resolved or pinged from the view client or end device itself. Moving on to some of the other issues that we listed in client connectivity. The first one, of course, was the black screen or black screen of display. Usually this is related to specific issues around PC over IP. Typically, the most common issue here is that the port required for PC over IP connectivity between the view client and the view desktop itself has been blocked. It's important to remember that PC over IP requires both TCP and UDP ports 4172 to be open for a view client to be able to connect to a view desktop. Another potential issue involving the black screen is that the view agent installed on the view desktop, which contains a specific display driver for PC over IP, has been overwritten. This can occur when, for example, a new version of VMware tools has been installed on the virtual desktop and the display driver has been overwritten. In each instance, these particular problems can be identified in the PC over IP server logs on the view desktop itself, on the virtual desktop, and you can see the location is written there. So if there's been an issue connecting to the display driver, you'll see this SVGA devtap error in the PC over IP server logs. If, for example, the firewall port, the ports have been blocked by a firewall, then you'll see the second log, which indicates a connection timeout between the view client and the view agent. The second issue is this poor quality of display. Typically this happens when PC over IP sees some kind of packet loss or bandwidth reduction on the connection. So packet loss from a PC over IP perspective is slightly different from normal network packet loss. If PC over IP identifies that packets have been dropped, PC over IP packets have been dropped, and this may happen due to network congestion, not just normal packet loss on a network, then PC over IP will adapt and reduce the amount of bandwidth available for that session. Within the PC over IP server logs on the virtual desktop, you'll actually be able to see this happen in the logs by looking for a bandwidth decrease message, and it will show you the old amount of bandwidth that was available and the new bandwidth that's been allocated to the session. If the bandwidth is reduced for the session, then you can expect the user experience to degrade. The final issue that we wanted to discuss was randomly disconnected sessions. Often this is actually not random and usually occurs 15 minutes after an initial connection has been established. When a view client connects to the view agent and the user is logged in, the workspace service manager process or session manager process is started on login. This process will then attempt to connect to the view connection server and provide session information to the connection server to indicate that a user has logged in and is using the actual virtual desktop. In some scenarios, the WSSM process may not get launched on login, and therefore the connection server does not believe that a user has a valid session on that particular virtual desktop. After 15 minutes, the connection server will attempt to shut down that session, and therefore the user will get disconnected. This can be seen in the view agent logs on the virtual desktop, and the specific message that you're looking for is pending expired. This suggests that the actual session management process is not connected to the connection server, and therefore the session will be shut down. What causes this? Well, typically the WSSM process is launched from the login process involving the GINA, and therefore some custom applications may interfere with this process or replace that particular entry in the registry entry around WSSM process with its own or another application launch. So check the registry and understand the process of daisy chaining GINA and understand how applications are launched on login. It's important to ensure that the WSSM process is launched from login when the user connects. The second problem domain involves desktop not available. This is where the user would have authenticated to the view connection server and will now have the opportunity to connect to a specific virtual desktop. Some of the common issues we see here is that a desktop may not be available, i.e. that it may have run out of the required number of desktops in a desktop pool. It could be caused by pooled provisioning issues whereby desktops were not provisioned due to possibly customization or other provisioning errors. The desktops may have been provisioned, but the actual view agent on the virtual desktops is not communicating with the broker, and therefore the broker is not aware that the desktop is available. Or it could be that the user actually has connected to the desktop, but their single sign-on has failed, and the user is stuck at the desktop login screen. Again, one of the easiest areas to check for one of these specific issues is the connection broker and view agent logs. And of course, the specific and important logs will be also registered in the event database. The first thing we need to look for in the connection broker logs is that the desktop, or the user, has a number of desktops returned to it once they've authenticated to the connection broker. And you can see here once again the unique session ID for my user session is listed in this particular log. And the foreign security principal for the user is also listed in bold. But specifically, this particular log indicates that a pool of desktops that has 3 available virtual desktops has been returned to the view client, and therefore the desktops are available for the user to connect to. So now we're going to look through a successful connection and what to look for. Once the user has a list of desktops returned to the view client, they'll choose a particular virtual desktop and they'll attempt to connect to it. So once the view client requests a desktop, the event database will log this broker desktop request in the database. Similarly, the broker will attempt to allocate a session to the user. Once again, we're using the unique session ID for the user, and we're checking in the connection broker logs for this new managed session log. This will show you that the particular user is being allocated a virtual desktop session by the connection broker. Once again, we can see the foreign security principal in bold for that particular user. And we can see that the user has been allocated a virtual desktop from the pool test 2. Here the connection broker is attempting to allocate a specific virtual machine. Once it's done so, it will also place this in the event database with the broker machine allocated message. So once the user has been allocated a session, the connection broker will then attempt to sign on to that particular virtual desktop on behalf of the user. Once again, in the logs here you can see in bold the unique session ID for the message using domain for SSO mprior. So mprior is the domain that we're attempting to connect to for that particular session. Without this message in the connection broker logs, the user won't be logged in, and you'll guarantee that the user is stuck at the typical Microsoft login message when connecting to a virtual desktop. So now that the broker has authenticated the user onto the virtual desktop, the broker will attempt to start a session on the virtual desktop. And here, in the actual connection broker logs, we'll see that for that specific unique session, that the broker logs a start session, sending start session message to the view agent. Correspondingly, in the virtual desktop, the view agent logs show us that the desktop manager component on the view agent received the start session message from the connection broker, and it also recognizes or states that the start session has been added for the particular domain and user. In the event database, this will show up as the view agent pending or waiting for acknowledgement for the connection broker that the session has been started on the agent. So our session has been started on the agent by the broker. Now what can happen is our client may now attempt to connect to the VM. And this is where essentially the view client will use PC over IP to connect to the view agent. So on the view agent on the virtual desktop, the PC over IP server component must be started. And in the view agent, what we will see is this message here stating that the VMware View Client PC over IP interaction handler has been loaded. The view client will then attempt to connect to the virtual desktop or the view agent, and we'll see 2 specific log entries in the view agent. The first one is that the P0P connection has begun, and the second one is this WTS session logon. We'll see this both in a P0P and an RDP session. So one of the important things to remember here is that each of these log entries should exist or will be there on a successful connection. If these particular log entries don't exist, then you know that at some point throughout the client connection process there was a problem. And using this list of specific log entries, you can identify where that connection or where that problem may exist in the connection process. Another important consideration is when you're looking at a multi-broker environment. So, for example, you may be load balancing 2 or more connection servers to provide a highly available solution. It's important to use a text editor tool that can actually search across multiple files, as you'll want to search across all of the connection broker logs to establish which connection broker the user originally logged into. All of their session logging information will be on that specific connection broker from that point forward. So, from a desktop not available perspective, what else should we be looking for? Well, pool provisioning is one particular area where you may see some issues, and typically sometimes a desktop pool might not reach its maximum number of desktops due to some kind of provisioning error. So you can check the status of a pool in the View Administrator and in the dashboard, or just through clicking on the pool within View Administrator, and it will tell you whether or not there's been a provisioning error. You can also see this through the status of problem desktops in the View Administrator dashboard. And some of the common issues around provisioning may be, for example, lack of storage or lack of connectivity to a virtual center server, or possibly even incorrect credentials between View Connection Server and vCenter Server. Also, in the event database, a broker provisioning error will be registered with a little bit more information as to why the provisioning error occurred. Sometimes, of course, desktops are not available because they fail to finish customization. So again, here you want to check the status of desktops. If you click on problem desktops in the dashboard, it will show you which desktops have not finished customization, and usually their status has agent unavailable listed under the status there. And as I mentioned earlier, you can check the View dashboard for this. And why do customization issues occur? Well, this could be the fact that the desktop may not have connectivity to Active Directory. You may not have provided the correct credentials for the desktop to join Active Directory, or there could be some kind of DNS issue between the desktop and Active Directory. Finally, one other issue, of course, could be that possibly the desktop did not receive an IP address and therefore has no network connectivity. This can occur possibly when people may restrict the number of ports on a vSwitch, and therefore when trying to provision, say, 128 desktops on a particular ESX host, you may run out of virtual ports available on the virtual switch. If you have provided incorrect domain credentials for View Composer to register desktops into the domain, you'll see this particular log entry that you see at the bottom here in the View Composer logs, which specifically states there's been a domain join error and that access is denied. If this is the case, of course, double check that you do have the correct domain credentials available to View Composer. You can do this simply by attempting to join a virtual desktop to the domain using those credentials that have been provided. Similarly, you may want to check that you have the correct credentials for the View Connection Server as well, and therefore the account that you've given View Connection Server to connect to Virtual Center Server, you can log into Virtual Center Server using the vSphere client and those credentials, and checking that you can actually create virtual desktops on the Virtual Center Server itself. The next problem domain is if there may be a specific issue wrong with the View Connection Server or View Broker, the broken broker. Common issues here we see are inability to connect to vCenter Server, possibly View Composer errors, interconnectivity issues between the different View components, which relies on the Java message service, or possibly configuration replication issues between multiple connection brokers. So here we can actually expand the number of areas that we can look at. Of course, we can look at View Administrator and the dashboard, the event database, but also from an Atom perspective, View will start to log application events in the Windows event logs. We will need to check the View Composer logs for specific View Composer issues, and of course again the View Connection Server logs. One of the first things to check is to ensure that connection brokers are replicating their configuration information between connection brokers. This is specifically for a multiple connection broker environment, where maybe you are load balancing between connection brokers. And in this scenario, connection brokers will be exchanging configuration information about user entitlement to pools, about pools themselves, using Atom. So the Atom log is available through the Windows event log on the connection broker. Unfortunately, the error reporting is not specifically detailed enough to be useful, and therefore what we do actually rely on is using the repadmin.exe to show us the current state of replication for Atom on a connection server. And here on the slide you can see the exact command line to provide command to provide to get that status. Another key thing is vCenter server connectivity. It's quite obvious if there's a problem with View and vCenter server connectivity, as the status of vCenter server is shown in red on the View administration UI. Also in the event database will be logged some VC down events. If VC does go down, this isn't massively critical, but it does impact provisioning and power operations. Users can still log into virtual machines, virtual desktops that are powered on, and can also continue to use current sessions, although you would not be able to provide new desktops or power on desktops that are off. Of course, simply check the connectivity between connection server and vCenter server. This is typically over HTTPS over 443. Ensure that this port is available between the two servers. And as I mentioned earlier, you also want to check that you've got the correct credentials to connect to vCenter server. You can validate this using vSphere client to connect to vCenter server and using the credentials that you're testing. The next area to look at is View Composer. The most common issue with View Composer is when we see View Composed desktops that have been manually deleted, or pools have been manually deleted in vCenter server. It's important to stress that all View desktops and all View pools should be administered from the View Administrator console and not from vCenter server. If you do happen to manually delete desktops in vCenter server, you'll need to then clear up the entries in both the View Composer database and the View Atom database. The reason you have to do this is that if you delete the desktop, View Composer will attempt to re-provision the desktop, but because it already exists in the Composer database but not in Virtual Center server, we'll get this error in the View Composer log file: desktop composer fault, virtual machine with input specification already exists. If you see this error in View Composer, you'll know that there's some inconsistency between the Composer database and the Virtual Center database. To remedy this, simply follow the steps in KB article 2015112. The KB article number is listed on the slide. Another area of concern is JMS connectivity. JMS is the message backbone for all of the View components in VMware View. Specifically, JMS is used to communicate session information between the View agent and the View connection server, and also to check availability of View connection brokers between the View connection brokers themselves. The JMS connectivity is particularly latency intolerant, and therefore it's important to make sure that components are not split across WAN links. If you do split them across WAN links, or the JMS connectivity is interrupted, we start to get this split brain or split site issue, whereby one connection server may think that another connection server has gone down and will start to provision desktops or act on its own. Similarly, we may get issues where View agent doesn't report the correct session information to the View connection servers, and therefore when users attempt to log in, they're not getting the latest session information or availability information. If there is an issue with JMS connectivity, it should show in the View dashboard and it shows a red status around the view connection server. From a connection server logging perspective, the log entries will show a rejoin message or a resync message, and this will tell you whether there has been a JMS connectivity issue or whether message is being delayed. In either case, you should ensure that the link between view connection servers and view agents or view desktops is based on a low latency link, preferably LAN-like quality. Our final problem domain is around performance issues, or why is my desktop slow? The most common issue around performance is related to storage, but we may also see issues around memory contention, CPU contention on the vSphere host, or network issues. Here, rather than looking at specific view components, we're looking at vCenter server or potentially third-party tools such as Liquidware Labs Stratosphere or Zangati, or any of the other virtual infrastructure specific monitoring tools available. So some of the key things to look for are CPU utilization, memory utilization, and storage performance. From a CPU utilization perspective, it's important to keep both host and cluster utilization below 80%. This will provide you a buffer to deal with any peaks in user workload requirements, or potentially in a high availability event when a host may go down and we move desktops onto the other hosts in the cluster. Similarly, you want to make sure that VM utilization does not go above 90%. If it does for a long period of time, you may want to consider adding an additional vCPU to the VM. We can also use ESXtop and to some extent vCenter servers to check percent ready time to ensure that our VM is adequately getting scheduled on a physical core. Our current recommendations are to look at between 7 to 11 VMs per core. Using this sizing, you should be able to get an acceptable performance for an average office type use case. I would check online for VMware's performance best practices around View to look at more information for this. From a memory utilization perspective, again, we recommend keeping the host within 80% utilization. Similarly, for VM utilization, you want to ensure that the VM has adequate memory. Keep in mind that when sizing VMs for memory, you'll need to consider the storage impact of allocating too much memory to a VM. Clearly, you'll see performance issues if you don't provide enough memory to the VM. Use vCenter server here to check VM utilization. We have often seen issues with particularly maybe Java applications which manage memory themselves, and it's hard for us to balloon or gain back memory from the VM. We want to avoid swapping and ballooning, as this provides or in effect has a performance overhead on the ESX host. From a storage perspective, it's important to keep within our VMFS LUN recommendations. For VMFS, we recommend no more than 120 link clones per VMFS LUN. This is to avoid SCSI reservation conflicts. From an NFS perspective, our vendors are recommending around about 250 VMs per LUN. Again, don't exceed this, as this is what's recommended by the vendor to guarantee performance. From a VM perspective, disk read latency should be less than 20 milliseconds. Anything above this, and we know that users will be experiencing performance issues. So, just to summarize on getting help here, make sure that you read the product documentation. Both the View Administration Guide and the View Architecture Planning Guide provide good information on sizing and troubleshooting your environment. Double check your configuration. Make sure that you haven't made any mistakes during the configuration of either View or the View pools. As I said earlier, use kb.vmware.com. Most of the common issues have been captured and resolutions and workarounds are provided on this website. Alternatively, if it's not, communities.vmware.com is a great forum where you may gain additional information and any kind of issues that you might see. On the View Connection Server itself, where the View Connection Server is installed, is a file called support.bat. If you run this, it will extract the logs from the connection servers and also run a number of diagnostic tests. You can use this to check the current state of your environment, and it's actually useful or required to do this before submitting a support request. And of course, ultimately, if you do get stuck, submit a support request and ensure that you run support.bat so you have a bundle of logs and diagnostic information to pass our support personnel. So to wrap up our presentation today, it's important to understand where the issue may lie, and this requires a good understanding of the view architecture and each of the components' function. Understand the relationship between the client, the agent, the server, view composer, and the vSphere infrastructure. Understand the problem domains, and understand some of the common issues that may occur. Know which tools you can use to diagnose if there's a problem, from the view dashboard to the events database, and the different logs for each of the view components. Understand what a successful client connection looks like so you can track to see where a specific failure may have occurred. And once again, check the logs and use tools such as Notepad++ to check across multiple logs and correlate the different logs via the user session ID or foreign security principal, username or domain name. Finally, you can get help across the different online resources such as the kb.vmware.com site, communities.vmware.com site, or ultimately submitting a support request to our global support service. So, thanks again for taking the time to watch this presentation today. I hope you found it useful, and good luck in your view deployments.